Hey guys, today we're going to start out with comparing fast twitch versus slow twitch muscle fibers. Just for a brief overview, what's a slow twitch muscle fiber? What's a fast twitch muscle fiber? When are we going to use them? Slow twitch, we're going to use them more leisurely when we're doing aerobic exercise, when we're using fat as our main energy source. And your slow twitch muscle fibers are vital and important when it comes to stabilization. So, for example, when you're doing an overhead press, you want to make sure those stabilizers are in place, allowing for us to optimally perform that concentric contraction. Then we have our fast twitch muscle fibers, which are used for anaerobic endurance, anaerobic respiration, and this is when we're going to use the glycolytic phosphocreatine system, which we'll go over in a little bit. But this is when you want to perform at your max amount of energy, exertion. For example, when you're doing sports, playing football, when you're doing strength training, powerlifting, those minute amount of seconds where we have the most amount of strength and power is where we're going to use these fast twitch muscle fibers in comparison to your slow twitch muscle fibers. So, type 1 fibers, slow twitch, are built for aerobic endurance. They'll utilize oxygen phosphorylation more via aerobic respiration, and rely heavily on using fat and fatty acid oxidation. Remember, we use fat as our main energy source when it comes to leisure exercise. However, glucose takes over when we're going to go through high intensity, low oxygen states when we're really sweating out there. Since type 1 muscle fibers have high mitochondrial density, in which they use a lot of oxygen, such as for the Krebs cycle and for the electron transport chain. Remember, we have our three energy processes: glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and electron transport chain. Glycolysis can use oxygen, but doesn't need it. Then we have our electron transport chain and then we have our Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain, which require oxygen. Remember, the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain happens in the mitochondria. So that's why when it says that has high mitochondrial density, produces a lot of ATP, it's because it uses this oxygen that's required for this Krebs cycle and electron transport chain to occur in order for us to have that high yield of ATP. Remember though, as we went over back a while back, we do have prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. Eukaryotic cells have a mitochondria. Prokaryotic cells don't have mitochondria. However, while eukaryotic cells are more efficient when it comes to producing ATP, prokaryotic cells can also go through all of these three energy systems without the use of ATP, without the use of oxygen. However, it just isn't as efficient. So when it comes to type 1 muscle fibers, it's both of these type 1 myosin heavy chains. These type 1 myosin heavy chains are what contract with actin. We have the myosin and actin within our muscle cells, and so this will go into play when it comes to calcium. We have the calcium influx with neurons going on to receptors. This will allow us to create this signaling and energy response for myosin and actin to perform that contraction. So type 1 myosin heavy chains are slower in contraction speed, but are highly efficient when it comes to ATP usage. That is why slow twitch muscle fibers are optimized for endurance, since they are not meant for contraction and power, but rather support aerobic respiration and efficiency in ATP usage. Type 1 muscle fibers tend to be high in myoglobin, which is a protein that in that muscle that stores oxygen. This is vital for ATP production within energy systems when going through muscle contractions. It is primarily stored in the heart and skeletal muscle. There's also a less calcium reuptake due to less developed sarcoplasmic reticulum. Remember, calcium ions play a vital role in ignition of the contraction of muscle. Less of calcium reuptake would result in less signaling of contraction, which explains why contraction speed is slower. Motor units are also smaller in size and have slower firing rates, indicating less of an impact towards maximum strength. Remember, so we have smaller in size motor units, and then we have higher in size motor units. And specifically, when it comes to anaerobic processes, when it comes to anaerobic, let's just say type 2 muscle fiber contractions, we want to use those big in size motor units. These big in size motor units are what's going to require us to be able to optimally pick up that weight or use our full amount of strength and energy in order for us to go through that concentric contraction, in comparison to those smaller type 1 muscle fibers that are going to use smaller motor units, because they're not meant for high intensity, heavyweight training. They're specifically meant to stabilize, which is why they use aerobic respiration. They don't require us to we don't use our slow twitch muscle fibers when we're going on the field and trying to perform optimally on, let's say, a football field. They are what's necessary in order for us to be stable, for us to use those fast twitch muscle fibers optimally. Those slow twitch muscle fibers, think of, for example, your supraspinatus or infraspinatus within your shoulder rotator cuff. This supraspinatus is what specifically pushes up and in toward your glenoid fossa, and your infraspinatus is really important for external rotation and will push down. Now, let's say your supraspinatus or infraspinatus isn't working optimally. These slow twitch muscle fibers, these stabilizer muscles, are what's required in us to reduce shoulder pain, to be able to perform, let's say, a shoulder press or bench press optimally. Someone that has, for example, weak stabilizer muscles, or one side of their posterior chain, which is your back muscles, that supports your, for example, let's say your shoulder, the supraspinatus and infraspinatus. If one side is lacking compared to the other, you'll notice very quickly that someone doing a bench press, their bench press is going to be off. They're going to have one side that's higher than the other. You're going to obviously see someone pushing more compared to the other, one side pushing more compared to the other, and you're going to notice a lack of balance. Those stabilizer muscles are crucial when it comes to um, balance, when it comes to stabilization. So they require more ATP. I mean, they require more oxygen, and they require more of the use of a leisure use, because they're not meant for that fast twitch power and strength performance. They're used to support those fast twitch muscles in order for us to perform optimally. It's important for us to have a balance, because if we have all fast twitch muscle fibers, then we're going to give out a lot more easier, where those slow twitch muscle fibers are going to come into play and make sure that we have a balance of stabilization along with power and fast reaction time. Okay. So now that we kind of went over the difference between a type 1 muscle fiber, which is primarily used for stabilization, we need those stabilizers in order for us to contract properly through the concentric and eccentric, and they require more oxygen but produce more ATP. Let's go over and see what type of muscles are rich in type 1 muscle fibers. So to remember, type 1 fibers dominate in postural muscles, and muscles used for endurance or continuous activity, which just means, for example, let's just say you're going on a light jog, right? You're not going to give out easily, I hope. Or let's say those postural muscles, those muscles in the posterior chain, which my back right now is killing me because I'm excessive kyphosis during this little video. But they're important for us to have that pain. So if you ever have pain, let's say you're doing a bench press, you're like, my shoulder's killing me, or you're doing a squat, for example, and you're leaning back. Those are examples of your stabilizer muscles. Either, well, one, if you have shoulder pain, it might be an issue with, for example, you might have torn something. There's tests to do that, which we'll go over at some point. But it's probably more of likely that your postural chain, your posterior chain, your posterior muscles are lacking, and a lack of activation, because you're in positions like this where your anterior deltoids are overactive and your posterior chain's underactive, right? So that's why it's really important to have a balance between type 1 and type 2 muscle fibers. While type 2 muscle fibers may be important for your bench press or football or soccer or any sport that requires a lot of energy immediately, it's not what's going to be stabilizing in order for you to perform and continually do that motion, right? You're not going to be 100% 100% of the time. You're going to have times where you're 20%, 50%, and then you have bursts where you're going to have 100% outtake. But in times where you're leisurely going throughout the game, you're going to need those type 1 muscle fibers, slow twitch muscle fibers, to take into play, take into action. So this is some muscles where they require, or is a type 1 dominance role. We have our soleus, which is our calf, maintains upright posture, long duration standing. We have our rectus spinae, placed in our lower back, and so this is postural control of the spine. Multifidus, deep spinal stabilizer muscle. Your tibialis anterior, infraspinatus, supraspinatus, as we talked about, really important for pushing into your glenohumeral joint into the fossa. A lot of people, specifically that I've worked with in the past, have had shoulder pain, and we've gone through specific external rotations and like having your arms 90 degrees. Um, and you notice that as they put themselves in weird postural positions that require more of the back muscles, that they can't really perform them well or are feeling pain. And so this is a great example of showing that these stabilizer muscles are vital when it comes to not only just, let's just say, leisure activities and performance on sports and activities elsewhere, but is very vital when it comes to even simply something such as pain, where you're just walking around and shoulder pain's bugging you. It's probably because you're overactive and you're missing stabilized muscles that are vital when it comes to reducing pain and making sure your body's posturally aligned. We also have our diaphragm, which diaphragm is constant rhythmic activity, breathing, external, internal obliques, posterior tone and breathing. You got trapezius, upper fibers, which are scapular elevation and support during low load holding. You notice someone, right? And so there's tests specifically for your posterior chain that you can see and say, hey, okay, maybe I'm actually not using my stabilizer muscles enough, and that is why I'm feeling this pain. And then there's also even like mixed muscles, right? Or even with mixed muscles, for example, your quadriceps, certain heads like the vastus intermedius contain more type 1 and type 2 muscle fibers. So it isn't as simple as like my quadricep is just a pure type 2 muscle fiber. It's only just going to be able to perform fast twitch exercises. There is mixed of type 1, type 2 muscle fibers, type 1 stabilization, type 2 maximum performance. And so this is important for a balance. So when it comes to anything, a balance perfectly is what's required for us to do anything optimally. So, trained actions. When trained via aerobic endurance or long, slow distance work, there's mitochondrial density and oxidative enzymes, citrate synthase. Remember, mitochondrial density is important for that ATP production. You got your capillary density, connect when it comes to transporting deoxygenated blood, oxygenated blood. For example, the first thing I'm thinking of when it comes to the veins and the arteries is our liver. We have the hepatic artery. You've got a portal vein, and out comes your hepatic vein. These veins and arteries are vital when it comes to blood cell transportation. We have our liver globules inside our liver, and that's vital when it comes to collecting. From what I'm pretty sure, it's been a while. This our blood cells, and it would take in even deoxygenated and oxygenated blood, but we're not going to go over that right now. We got facts, increase of fat oxidation enzymes. We also have an expression of PGC1A. This is what promotes mitochondrial biogenesis. Remember, we want mitochondrial biogenesis because our mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. It's what produces ATP. And so an increase of mitochondrial biogenesis is great. The PGC 1A, 1 alpha is a transcriptional coactivator that regulates the genes involved in energy metabolism. It is the master regulator of mitochondrial biogenesis. This protein interacts with the nuclear receptor PPARY, which permits the interaction of this protein with multiple transcription factors. We also notice that as we use these slow twitch muscle fibers, lactate production goes down. And so why the hell is this? Remember, lactate is a byproduct of pyruvate. And so we, of course, when we're going through these three energy processes, glycolysis, Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain, we'll have the pyruvate and the pyruvate dehydrogenase complex that goes and becomes acetyl-CoA for the Krebs cycle. Remember, the Krebs cycle requires oxygen in the electron transport chain, right? So let's say that when we're going through anaerobic exercise, this is when we're going to need to use the glycolytic system in order for us to use glycolysis anaerobically. without the use of oxygen. And so this is when we're going to use pyruvate and turn it and use it as a byproduct of lactate in order for us to suppress this hydrogen accumulation. We went through last time that this fatigue that we're getting is this hydrogen accumulation, right? And so lactate, a byproduct of pyruvate, actually helps us withdraw from this, let's say, the soreness that you get from this hydrogen accumulation, because it helps NAD plus that turn to NADH turn back into NAD plus, and whatnot. It's also important for metabolic stress. We'll go over in a second, metabolite accumulation. But so when I say that lactate production is going down, this is because remember we're using slow twitch muscle fibers, type 1 muscle fibers, when we're in a leisure state, when we're using oxygen, right? And so we produce lactate when we're going through, let's say, the glycolytic system, when we're using glycolysis anaerobically, because we don't have oxygen, because we are lacking it. And this means that our body's using every other way to gain energy in order for us to outtake or perform. However, when we're leisurely going through a walk or something, our body is not screaming to us that we need to produce energy. It's leisurely going on its way. It's going through the glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and electron transport chain. However, when we're in that case where we're leisurely going through our day, we don't need to use this glycolytic system, or we don't need to use glycolysis anaerobically in order for us to have high yields of energy and perform, because we're just walking. So the lactate production is going to go down because lactate, a byproduct of pyruvate from glycolysis, is specifically going to be manifested when it comes to us needing lactate as a way to decrease hydrogen accumulation and decrease fatigue from anaerobic performance. So hormonal signaling pathways involved. There's the AMPK pathway. I don't, from what makes sense to me, I don't think we use this pathway much when it comes to the type 1 muscle fibers, because AMPK pathways went on before, which even last time I said I had a better idea of it. The anabolic catabolic processes that go on can be kind of complicated, but the AMPK pathway is used for when we're scarcity in ATP. So it's not necessarily an energy stress sensor that I think that we would be utilizing much when it comes to type 1 muscle fibers. However, as we said before, there's the PGC1A mitochondrial biogenesis type 1 fiber gene program. We have our and then we have specifically mTOR-C1. mTOR-C1, remember we have mTOR-C1 and mTOR-C2, but for right now, we're just going to focus on mTOR-C1, and so this is what's going to help increase lysosomal biogenesis. It's going to help increase protein synthesis and have those growth factors come onto the muscle cells into our integrins, in order for us to increase muscle growth. And so type 1 muscle fibers, when we're in a leisure state, when we're in a state of high fed state, when we're in a state of high nutrient abundance, this is when we're going to activate mTOR-C1. So that's why mTOR-C1 specifically is very well connected with type 1 muscle fibers, because type 1 muscle fibers, you're not going to go and use high yields of ATP. So in this case, it can cost and use a lot of ATP to perform mTOR-C1. mTOR-C1 requires ATP in order for us to grow. Remember, anabolic is the way of which we're growing, we're building, and catabolic is the process of us breaking down for like fuel. And so as mTOR uses that energy to grow, it needs to be in a high fed state, or in a state in which we're not killing ourselves. So that's why mTOR-C1 has a connection with type 1 muscle fibers. So a simplified breakdown: type 1 fibers, slow, oxygen-powered, fatigue-resistant muscle fibers built for endurance, posture, and low-force repetitive tasks, found in deep postural muscles and muscles we constantly use, thrive on fat and oxygen, and lots of mitochondria. Train them with aerobic activity, zone 2 cardio, and bodyweight folds, etc. Okay, so now we're going to go into our type 2 muscle fibers. These are fast twitch muscle fibers. These are what's going to be required to optimally perform, let's say, bench press, or when we're at max, squat, whatnot. This is when you're going to really be using a lot of energy and and be very low in oxygen in order for us to be using these type 2 muscle fibers. Of course, you don't need to have low oxygen in order for you to use them, but you're generally going to be in that state where you're just completely depleted, in which you're using these type 2 muscle fibers in the situation of a football game, or really pushing through those last seconds where you're using maximal amount of strength and power in order for you to reach that goal, or whatever the hell you're trying to do. Okay. Type 2 muscle fibers are fast twitch muscle fibers. Type 2 muscle fibers can be broken down into two groups. There's type 2A, fast oxidative, and type 2B, fast glycolytic muscle fibers. Type 2 muscle fibers are generally bigger than type 1 muscle fibers. They require more motor unit recruitment and yield more bigger motor unit size. Remember, motor unit size has a direct correlation to how much you can lift. You're going to want more motor unit size and faster motor unit recruitment the more you're using these type 2 muscle fibers. What I mean by type 2 muscle fibers can be broken down into two groups. We have our oxidative, with the fast oxidative and fast glycolytic. Think of fast oxidative. What I like to think of it is that we're using these oxygen-based systems, Krebs cycle electron transport chain. However, we're at the state by which our oxygen is slowly depleting down, and we're going to soon go to fast glycolytic, which requires just simply glycolysis, in which we're using it anaerobically without the use of oxygen. Remember, type 2 muscle fibers are meant and supposed to be used for anaerobic endurance, and meant for us, for example, when we're playing football and reaching those last few moments of, let's say, pushing forward for a touchdown. We're going to want to use those type 2 muscle fibers and exert the most amount of force you have, instead of leisurely going throughout your day and using oxygen and taking the time to really focus on stabilizing. You want to use type 2 muscle fibers to perform optimally with the most amount of strength at a certain given time. Type 2 muscle fibers are more explosive, but fatigue a lot more quicker. It makes sense because we're not using oxygen as efficiently. They're not optimized for long endurance training like type 1 muscle fibers. Within fast twitch muscle fibers, they consist of type 2 myosin heavy chains. These are contractile proteins that work with actin. Remember, like with type 1 myosin heavy chains, we have type 2. These contract with actin inside our muscle cells. These are type 2 type 2A myosin heavy chains encoded by myosin heavy chain 2 MYH2, in which has a higher ATP pace activity, meaning it's less ATP efficient because it uses a lot of ATP to lift heavier loads, concentric focused. But it doesn't have as much as type 2, the second type, which is the glycolytic type 2 muscle fibers that use the glycolytic system in comparison to the oxidative system. So type 2, the one when we're using the glycolytic system, we're going to be fatiguing basically a lot more quicker in comparison to when we're using the oxidative system. So although in terms of type 2 muscle fibers, we're performing a lot more powerfully, we're going to be less efficient when it comes to oxygen. But the more we go in from the oxidative state to the glycolytic state, that's when we're even using more of a depletion of ATP, which will hinder our fatigue and central nervous system a lot more. So type 2A can be used for moderate mitochondrial content, good for mixed aerobic tasks, and can convert to type 1 with endurance training. Type 2A is basically, like I said, using the oxidative systems, in which it's a mixed balance between going high intensity to kind of slowing down a little. You're not going full 100% where you're just going to completely give out after you're done doing with whatever you're doing. With type 2, well, I like to say type 2X, which is the second type of myosin type 2 muscle fibers, is they rely heavily on anaerobic glycolysis, produce lactate quickly. Remember, when it comes to type 1 muscle fibers, we're really focusing on these three energy processes: the glycolysis electron transport chain and the Krebs cycle electron transport chain. And so we have the pyruvate dehydrogenase complex that becomes acetyl-CoA going to the Krebs cycle. However, when we're having oxygen, we don't need to produce lactate as a byproduct because we're not having high accumulation of hydrogen. However, when it comes to us going through, like, let's say, using our type 2 muscle fibers, type 2X specifically, we're relying heavily on anaerobic glycolysis. This is when we're going to produce that, have pyruvate produce lactate as a byproduct, because we're having high accumulation of hydrogen and need to basically produce lactate to bring that down. Remember, we use type 2X muscle fibers when it comes to used during high power output but short duration, and convert to type 2A with training. Uh, so type 2X, fast glycolytic dominant muscles. Some examples are the biceps brachii, lifting, pulling, high type 2 in strength, trained individuals. We have the pectoralis major, the gastrocnemius, and the latissimus dorsi. The latissimus dorsi, our lats are for like doing pull-ups and rows and whatnot. So the reason when we do okay, so this goes on the next thing. The reason when we do mobilization corrective exercise with high reps and low weight is specifically because we're trying to use those posterior muscles. Remember, what are our posterior muscles consisted of? They're consisted of type 1 muscle fibers. They're consisted of muscles that are going to support our body. So when it comes to corrective exercise, when it comes to mobilization, when it comes to fixing posture, the reason why you're not going to see your personal trainer going up to you and saying we're going to lift really heavy loads and move it really fast is because we're not really focusing on fast twitch. We're not focusing on fast twitch muscle fibers. If we're trying to focus on fast twitch muscle fibers, then we're going to do heavy weights and we're going to go at a fast tempo, right? But in this case, if we're focusing on mobilization, corrective exercise, and focusing on fixing your posture and fixing those muscle groups that aren't being used properly, it's because of a lack of stabilization, which is a lack of the posterior chain. And so this is why we're going to want to do low weight, high amount of reps, because we're trying to reduce the amount of fatigue that we're bringing to our body. We're trying to increase the use of type 1 muscle fibers, which require us to be in a state where we're using a lot of oxygen, right? Because the stabilizer muscles can't handle high fatigue scenarios as much as these type 2 muscle fibers that are built for that case. So when it comes to you training specifically for stabilization, anything of the sort that requires these type 1 muscle fibers, these stabilizer muscles, that is why specifically you're going to want to do lightweight, high amount of reps, because the mobilization and the balance and all these actions that are required by type 1 muscle fibers are needed to be followed with being at a state where you're not killing yourself in comparison to the type 2 muscle fibers, which in that case, you're going to want to put yourself maximal exertion, maximum amount of weight, where you're going to increase the motor unit size, motor unit recruitment, because these type 2 muscle fibers are specifically meant to be used for that anaerobic state. So when realizing what you're trying to train for is really important for how you're going to train it. When it comes to balance, when it comes to corrective exercise, always do low weight, high reps to increase your chances of recruiting, just to solely be recruiting your type 1 muscle fibers. However, when it comes to training, for example, football or any sort of point by which you're going to be at maximal exertion, that's why you have an integration of power training, strength training. You have an integration of fast twitch muscle fiber training that requires that heavy weight and being at that low oxygen state in order for you to uh, increase increased usage of your type 2 muscle fibers, as along with when you're doing your that leisure state to use I mixed it up, type 2 muscle fibers for fast twitch state and type 1 muscle fibers for the leisure state. So just realizing that, which we'll go on next to, is that periodization, specific training for specific reasons, is really important when it comes to optimizing your performance as an athlete and any sort of individual that's really trying to increase their performance within their body.